QSO Today, episode 454, Bob Hopkins WB2UDC. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I am traveling to the United States and Washington State to visit my elderly father and to give my brother a break. I hope to visit the Clallam County Amateur Radio Club meeting next week to see how the hams are doing out on the Olympic Peninsula. As a result of my busy schedule, I'm replaying an earlier interview from the archive of QSO Today podcasts. After all of these years, almost 9 now, there is a lot of content in the QSO Today archives, and I hope that you will forgive me for occasionally running reruns. The problem with choosing which one is like selecting one of your many kids for a special duty. The selection is hard because all of the podcast interviews are entertaining and informative. Bob Hopkins WB2UDC agrees that having an Elmer was the fastest way to ham radio success, and by being an Elmer and paying it forward benefits everyone, including the Elmer, the new ham, and the hobby. WB2UDC loves to make large public demonstrations for kids by making contacts to the ISS, the International Space Station, and when they ran, the US Space Shuttles. This reprise of my conversation with Bob Hopkins WB2UDC from January 2016 is my QSO Today. WB2UDC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Bob?
4Z1UG, WB2UDC here. How are you, Eric?
I'm great, Bob. Thanks for joining me on QSO Today. Can we start at the very beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, my passion with radio started probably at 11 or 12 years old, messing around with somebody's old console radio that also had the shortwave bands. You know, those kind of radios that have the a dial on them that's and little tiny print of which I could read much better when I was younger. Little tiny print of what country you might hear, and you listen to the shortwave broadcast. And it was that kind of stuff that ignited the flame, and that sort of happened. 11 or 12 years old, and my father was someone who saw that I was finally getting interested in something and kind of did things to push the flames a little bit. And one of the things that he did when I was a kid was he bought me a night kit radio from Allied Radio. And, I don't have it any longer. And it was really a shame. But he bought me this radio, and I think the intent was that he and I were going to build this radio together. And didn't quite work out that well. My father was an engineer, and he was a Navy guy, and he always referred to himself as the old man. So if I refer to the old man here, I'm not dissing the old man. He that was his name. That's what he considered himself, the old man. So the old man gets me this radio, and he was a chemical engineer and did a lot of traveling around the state of Florida and California and Chicago. We were all over the country, and this happened to be in California when he bought me the radio. And so he gives me this radio as a gift. Maybe it was a Christmas gift or a birthday gift, and then he goes off for a week. And heck, I was fixing bicycles and doing all sorts of stuff using his tools. So how hard could it be to build a 3-transistor 2-band receiver kit that from Allied Electronics. It was not Allied Radio Shack back in the day. It was only $19.95 with no money down. and you could buy batteries for it for 10 cents a piece. And you could buy an accessory with an antenna for $1. I got the whole 9 yards. I got everything there. So I sat there and built this kit. And the kit, hardware-wise, building the chassis and putting the components onto the chassis and tightening the screws, I kind of did that all right. I kind of did that okay. But then it came to putting the electronic parts together. Now, to me now, that there really wasn't a lot of electronic parts, maybe 50 at the most. But back then, it seemed like there was thousands of parts. And I would try to follow the directions and keep in mind my attention span of a little kid that age was very, very short, and we were always in a hurry. And I found I needed a soldering iron. I got to find this soldering iron. I didn't know what one was. And so I found one in my dad's toolbox. The thing weighed about 5 pounds. It was a 200-watt soldering iron. And, it had a wire on the connector to the wall. Actually had fabric instead of the insulation was cloth. And it was not even, so I used that thing. It was it was the big inferno. And I cooked almost everything in the radio. And it was unbelievably, I figured if a little heat was good, a lot of heat would be better, along with a lot of solder. And Lord knows whether I used the right solder or not. I think I did, but I certainly did foul this thing up beyond recognition. And I was kind of heartbroken. I was afraid of what was going to happen when the old man came home from his business trip. I was crestfallen. That's a good term. And he comes home, and I immediately say, Dad, I goofed up the radio. I tried to build it, and it really didn't work out so well. And he looked at it, and he snickered a little bit. He said, and this is the engineer, my father. This is why I teach engineers, I think. And he was really my first mentor. The engineer in him said, let's see how we're going to solve this problem. And over a period of a summer, over the beginning of spring into summer, he had a friend that he knew from church, and it was a guy who happened to be Ed Miller, WA6OXE. And I didn't even know what all that stuff meant back then, but he shared this story with his friend Ed, who was an older gentleman, and turned out that at that time Ed was already licensed, and he was licensed back in the Spark days. So you talk about old guys, it was really, he knew ham radio up and down, and we got together with him, and he surveyed the thing, and he repaired my radio. He repaired my radio with me sitting there watching him do it. And in exchange for repairing my radio, I would do odd jobs around his house. And for as many hours as I would put in doing odd jobs, he would also let me sit down next to him at his desk, where he had this awesome transceiver. It was, to all our older audience out there, it was a Swan 240. That was a tri-band transceiver, covered 80, 40, and 20, mostly the phone bands. And he had a little dipole in his small yard in Redwood City, and he also had a vertical. He worked the world with that thing, and I was enthralled. I all of a sudden shifted from just listening to shortwave, which, by the way, that little super regen receiver ended up working very well, and I listened hours on end to the shortwave bands. But once I found you could actually talk to people, and as you can see by this, I'll occupy the microphone a great deal. You talk to people, and that's where I got bit. And it was that summer that the interest continued, and in 1962, I took my novice ham radio exam, everything including the code, and got a small DX40 transmitter that was made by Heathkit. It was already second hand or third hand by that point in time. It had a single 6146 in it, and it ran AM and CW, and it was crystal controlled. Back in the day, and I say this a lot, back in the day, the novices were limited to 75 watts input, and they had to be crystal controlled. And I had two crystals. on 40 meters. And it was 7154 and 7168. I was the mayor of both of those frequencies. And the receiver was brand new. The receiver that I got was brand new. And that was my first real education of following directions. I had to build this Heathkit HR10 receiver, which was an all-band ham receiver, which I still have. And it's really a great receiver. Kind of broadband. It gives you the opportunity to listen to several signals at the same time. And I like that. And I had that receiver, and I had to build the whole thing. And I said, with the supervision of Mr. Miller.
And a different soldering iron, of course.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I think all of our dads in those days had that soldering iron in the garage with the cloth-covered wire, because I think they used it to repair the radiator on the car.
Could very well have been that.
As I recall. What was your first call sign? Do you remember?
Yes, WN6GOS. My father referred to it as his Gosling, or goofing off student, if you do it phonetically. And WN6GOS was my first. And the amazing thing was, not like today, I found my call sign out long before I got my license. Because I used to get I would get on somebody's mailing list before they had computers. Somebody's mailing list for QSL cards or catalogs or invitations to subscribe to a magazine. As soon as they got the call, but it took a lot longer for the FCC to send it to me. So I took the test, and the hint was, yeah, you passed it, but I couldn't go on the air, even though I found out my call letters until I got the piece of paper, And WNC, I still have a copy of that license. I found it the other day. It's on parchment, but it was. I got that license, and the novice license was only good for a year, and it was not renewable. And the big trap with the novice license was that you were allowed to do CW on the HF bands, 80, 40, and 15, and you were allowed to do phone on 2 meters, because 2 meters was like a vast wasteland at that point. Not a lot of people used it, so I think that the plan was to encourage use. A lot of my friends who got their novice license back in those days, and I really wanted to do this, but Mr. Miller was kind of a strict guy, and he would not allow me to put a microphone on anything until I was done with my novice career. He said, you have to learn the code, you have to do that, and to this day, I am grateful for that kind of discipline that I got. I really am, because I'm fairly good at CW now, and I can talk.
So you upgraded to general the following year?
Well, it was not even a year. It was within 7 or 8 months after, because I was on all the time. And I didn't think I was going to like CW. I was complaining about that the whole time. I don't know what to do this Morse code. But I really wanted to learn it, so I did all these things. I finally learned CW, improved my code speed by listening to these records by a guy named, I think his name was Russ Farnsworth.
Yes.
He turned out to be a member of the radio club that Mr. Miller got me to join. Russ, and the Farnsworth method is sort of sending the letters at a faster speed, but keeping the pace of the signal at a slower speed. And he was a visually impaired man, and fabulous voice. I don't know if you've ever heard it. I'm sure they still have the recordings.
I used those records myself in 1973.
Well, there you go. Smart guy. And that's how I learned. And and every now and then Mr. Miller would go on, and he'd work me to see how I was doing. And finally, we had enough contacts, and I'd say, "How fast am I going?" "Oh, you're about 7 words a minute, 8 words a minute." and I never. And so I said, and then he come up one day and says, "We're going into the customs house in San Francisco for you to take your general class." Hell, what? Are you kidding me? And so he drove me in, and they didn't tell you whether you passed. Boy, they got it easy nowadays. You had to suffer, right? They wouldn't tell you when you took the exam whether you passed. And the first thing that they did before you took the written exam, of course, was they put the headphones on you, and they were really military cans. They're big old headphones. You put them on, and they'd start sending the code, and they sent a bunch of V's, da 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 da. And I'm saying, geez, yeah, okay. And I'm writing down V's on everything. I'm writing everything down. And then they sent some text. I don't think it was even a contact. It was just text. It was a paragraph out of some book. And I wrote everything down. And I figured I must have been sitting there for the technician test, although they rarely did they do 5 words a minute there at the customs house. But it was, sure enough, it was 13 words a minute. I had been tricked into being underconfident, but I really did a good job and copied everything. And so then I had to take the written, and my mom gave me a postcard. It's probably my first serious QSL card, although I had hundreds of one as a novice. She gave me this postcard, and she self-addressed postcard. She said, I hear that you can give this to the examiner after you're done with the exam, and if you pass, you'll get he'll mail it back to you, letting you know. And I still have that card as well. And
well, that's very cool.
And the date that I took the exam was July 11th, 1963. And I got married July 11th, 1970. I don't know. 7-11 is a good number. So,
how did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, I became, science and technology since my dad was an engineer, and he pushed me in that way. I had my chemistry set that I stunk up the house with. I had all sorts of things that I broke and we tried to fix and take apart. And I was always interested, and radio became the focus because that was just completely fascinating doing stuff. I figured I would be an electrical engineer. I figured that's what I would do as a grown up, and took all the college prep courses in high school, and that was my goal. I did not become an electrical engineer. I'm a computer scientist. I think computer science to me is for those with attention deficit. Yeah, because I can get stuff done quicker with computers than I could with the electrical engineering. But I still love both of them, and they're very worthy careers. And it's driven me to the things that I do, and it's the different types of professions that I have pursued. Although I've been at what I do now for a very long time, and I'm in the education business, and I do believe that the model that the amateur radio passion and the concept, the fraternity, if you will, sets up, where one mentors another to get them through, and the ability of a young kid having access to people who are infinitely smarter and informed, and they freely share the information, was something that inspired me. And I thought I was going to be a millionaire, not a teacher, but I ended up being a teacher only because there's never enough money, so might as well be a teacher.
I think I had the same experience. I just, as a teenager, I had access to the smartest people I'd ever met. What a thing was that? And that was amateur radio. Let me ask you, you told me in the interview before we started the recording that you've been at the Cooper Union in New York City since 1972. Can you tell us what is the Cooper Union and what's your role there?
Well, the Cooper Union is actually the name is the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. It was founded in 1859 by an industrialist and philanthropist named Peter Cooper. And very interesting guy. And his goal when he founded this place was to provide education for the children of the working class citizens in New York City. And he said education should be as free as air and water. And so from its founding until just recently, we managed to pull off offering a free education to those people who managed to qualify for admission. It is a quite competitive place. I'm the chief technology officer at Cooper Union, and I'm also a associate professor of computer science. I teach computer programming to the students, but I'm the chief technology officer, which sort of implies that if wires are involved and it doesn't work, it's my problem. So anything having to do with technology at Cooper Union, I've been shepherding along for a long time, and it's a great place to work. and there have been many hams that have come out of this place, and it's kind of cool there.
Does the Cooper Union have a ham radio station or a ham radio club?
We've had one at times, and I was the advisor to it. However, the workload required of our engineers is so significantly tough that they don't have a lot of time for doing anything else. The 18 to 20 credits a semester, it's grueling, and so while we have a ham radio club in spirit. I have a rig here in the office, but the kids don't really get to mess around with the technology. And in Manhattan, it's hard to set up, especially in the building that we're in. It's hard to put up an antenna to do anything serious. But I have quite a few hams. One of my students was Mary Alestra, KB2IGG, and she was Young Ham of the Year many years ago. And she came into my office, Professor Hopkins, I understand that you're an amateur radio operator. She's now an assistant attorney general for the state of New York. She's doing very well. I think that's what she does now. What a wonderful thing. In fact, her first mentor was someone that you interviewed on this, Carol Perry, and it was really it's a small world in ham radio, but it's a pleasure to work at Cooper Union. It's always been. We do interesting stuff, state-of-the-art stuff as far as computer science is concerned, and all my students do very well when they get out of here.
Well, having been there for so long, then you've actually seen probably the technology, turn over more than a few times. If you're subject to Moore's law, then the infrastructure and the materials and the equipment that you're using has probably had a facelift, half a dozen times, I would think.
Oh, at least it's certainly gotten smaller. And I show the kids in my first class what it was like to be a freshman engineering student, and I bring in all the things that I had. My home entertainment system in the dorm that I lived in was this 5-transistor national AM transistor radio, and I had a manual portable typewriter, and I did have a 10-inch picket slide rule, and then I had
a telephone with a dial.
Yeah, sure. Don't get me talking about telephones; I'll get in trouble. But we had a telephone with a dial, and actually, you could dial the telephone by if you were good at, which I was very good at sending things on a lever. You could dial a telephone just by pushing the buttons on the top. Click, 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 click. Especially if it was a payphone. Anyway, the initial time, my conversations with computers began by punching cards, 80-column tab cards. And so I had stacks of them, and editing meant replacing the card. And everything was in uppercase. And the computers were large and noisy, and all the rooms had to be air-conditioned, which was an advantage. And over time, they got more interesting, more complex in what you can do with them, and a lot smaller. There's not as many lights on these things anymore as I like the lights. I used to send messages in the lights on the console of the computers. And I did a lot of work with computers. I've done a lot of work with computers, and I'm fairly competent in that area. I probably do that better than ham radio, but ham radio is always learning, isn't it?
What kind of impact did amateur radio have on your family life?
Well, it's funny. Growing up as a kid, this was encouraged by my parents. Now, a lot of people, they think that, and I urge parents to encourage their kids to do interesting things like that. I was encouraged. So anything I did, my dad built me a shack when we moved. He built me. He helped me put up antennas. He found my first Elmer for me. I did interfere every television in the neighborhood, especially when after I got my general and went on 15 meters, which old TVs had an IF frequency close to 15 meters, so you couldn't help but overload those guys. And I learned to get around that. But AM, boy, they could hear your voice perfectly. So that was always very supportive. And my family, now that I'm grown up, and I've got 4 kids, all grown up, and 5 grandchildren, not quite so grown up, although one of them's in college. My youngest son, couple of years ago, 10 years ago now, because he's renewed his license for Father's Day, the Saturday before Father's Day. He said, "Hey, Dad, let's go. Let's take a trip. We're gonna go to this school." I said, "Where are we going?" So we get in my Jeep and we drive over to this junior high school that's in an adjacent county. And as I pull up, I see there's a bunch of cars there with the mobile whips and call letters on the plates. And I says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm taking my ham radio." So that was his Father's Day gift to me, was getting his ham license. I don't know if it gets any better than that, but
yeah, that's pretty cool.
KC2 KFP out there, he's. I'll let him listen to this.
What rig do you operate now?
I have an Elecraft KX3. I have every rig on the planet, actually, but the one I use is the KX3 right now. What a great radio. And I've got and Elecraft, they're brilliant. They design add-ons to be modularly installed on them, and they release they release rumors about it to get your whistle wet, and then they release the product close to the holidays and gift giving season, and then if somebody who doesn't know much about ham radio calls up, they're very comfortable with explaining to XYLs and stuff what it is that I was looking at in the magazine. In fact, my very first rig, my wife has bought me lots of ham stuff, but the biggest surprise was when she got me the Elecraft K1, and I was looking in CQ magazine, my favorite magazine. I was looking at CQ magazine, and there was an ad for the K1. I said, "Oh," and I pointed it out there. "Boy, this is really cool." And I still have that, of course, and it's all tricked out. And I said, "It's really cool. This is amazing." She said, "Oh yeah." I says, "Yeah, look at how small it is." And they had a little 9-volt battery in the picture next to it to demonstrate, because the darn thing wouldn't run off of a 9-volt battery. But I mean, it wouldn't run for long. But they had it right next to it. I said, "Oh, look at that." So wouldn't you know, Christmas time comes around, and she says, I get this thing. I says, "How'd you know what to order?" She said, "I called up, and they asked all sorts of questions. And they wanted to make sure that I had a telegraph key in the house." It was really great. And so that I had that. I have an ICOM 735. I have one of my first grown-up rigs that I ever built, a Heathkit SB102 that I built. That one worked, didn't smoke, and I still have that. I have a Ten-Tech Argonaut 509. One of my former students gave it to me, and that's cool radio. I don't have enough time to use them, but it's certainly fun to have them all there.
Do you run the KX3 barefoot, or do you take it in the field?
I've taken it. I take both the KX3 and the K1 in the field. I also have. Last year, I got the 100-watt afterburner for it. Just because on occasion I like to be able to work everybody. 100 watts is the most power I ever dare run. I just have no call, because I can almost work everybody here that way. In fact, when I was a little kid, I should have mentioned this. For some reason, I had this goal. The goal was, number one, be able to work everybody that I could hear on the radio. And with the first radio that I had, the HR-10, I heard many people. I didn't even have to change frequencies. They'd heterodyne off the shortwave stations. And then the second goal was I really thought it was cool to write an article for a magazine. And the third goal would be to give a talk at a ham club. And I've accomplished all those goals, although working everyone I hear is a little out there. You can never do that. But those are lofty goals. And that was a goal that I started early on. So I run the Elecraft pretty much now at 100 watts. lately, the last couple of contacts I made, and I don't make a lot of them. Although for New Year's Day, I decided, since I joined the Straight Key Century Club, or whatever, the Straight Key Club, or whatever that was, I decided I was going to use a J38 key, something actually older than me, to send CW. And I got to tell you, I'm much better with my keyer. I sounded terrible, but I could copy the code fine, But sending it, I really needed some practice. But it was good. There was some contest on, and I participated in that. It was a straight key contest, and I did that. So I love CW. I think CW is one of the most fascinating modes that you can do.
And now this mid-show break. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I'm now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSOTodayCommunity.com website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445 on, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think it is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I'm not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon anymore, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for the transcriptions. There is a new section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. This week's donations are down to be equal with my former commercial sponsor. I don't have a sad puppy picture to display, but I hope that if you are not a sponsor, you will step forward to keep the lights burning here at QSO Today. This week's new listener sponsor is Chuck Lucas, WG5X, as an annual sponsor, and I want to thank Joe Robin, N9OK, for his $50 donation. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at QSOtoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that QSO Today will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. The majority of the people that I talk to on the QSO Today podcast would agree with you. For some reason, and I don't think it's because I'm choosing CW operators. I think that people who've been in the hobby a long time just kind of they gravitate back to it for a lot of different reasons. Bob, you caught my attention by the beautiful tribute that you wrote in CQ magazine. I think it was probably in September, that you paid to a silent key Don Lasha, W2DL, who passed away last year. How important were mentors like Don in your ham radio life and in your life in general?
Well, Don was my high school physics teacher, and Don played the role of a mentor in a variety of aspects in my life. I had imagine a high school kid gone 3 years to a high school in California, and very comfortable and reasonably socially accepted, and doing ham radio in California. We had a house high on a hill, so everything was working pretty well. Height is good for antennas. And then my father tells me that we're moving, and we move before my senior year started in 1965. We moved to Wyckoff, New Jersey, and I'm a fresh senior, as I called myself, a fresh senior, and I moved in there, and I spent the whole summer lost. I really did. It was a tough time, and when school started, before school started, we went into the guidance counselors and had set up my courses and all that kind of stuff, and the old man figured out that they had a radio station, a broadcast, FM educational broadcast station at this high school that I was going to. And he said, I bet you should get involved in that. And so I mentioned it to the guidance counselor, who, nothing against guidance counselors now, but who discouraged me because, as a senior, the advisor of the place already had all of his crew picked out, and he likes to bring them up through the years. I said, oh. And so I was a little bummed out by that. And my father said, no, you have a general class ham license, for crying out loud. You should be able to do that. Go find him on your first day and get yourself in there. And that's what I did. I walked up to him and said, I'm WB2UDC. I'm a general. I'd like to work at your radio station, I said to him. He said, really? And what a smart guy. What a smart guy. And he immediately... I was immediately integrated into their program. I got to do all sorts of interesting things. In fact, I thought I was going to work in broadcasting when I got out of high school. I thought that would be a great career, and worked for a couple of small radio stations. I worked for a radio station that he got me a job at as an engineer, and I even did behind the mic stuff, and that was fun. So he did that. He was a physics teacher, a chemistry teacher. He ran the broadcast station. It was like the AV guy. He was probably their, quote, chief technology officer. And I maintained a friendship with him until he passed. And I would go everywhere with him. I would go to, he was the one who got me to go to Dayton maybe 10 years ago. And my first trip that's like a pilgrimage. And he and I went out to Dayton, and I've been going ever since. And he also would go to various flea markets around, and I wasn't his best student, don't get me wrong. I mean, in fact, I probably was closer to his best cut-up to a student. I considered education sort of like taking a cruise on a cruise ship, and lucky I didn't. Lucky that I didn't have any serious problems, and I had good guidance. I could have ended up in bad times, but I've been very fortunate. And he was one of the ones that would give me advice on a variety of things, educationally, as well as his ability to absolutely understand and fix any piece of electronics I've ever seen. It was like unbelievable. And I remember one time he and I he was building a remote transmitter for a broadcast that we were going to do for the station. And he didn't have a tube socket for this tube that he was putting into one of the stages of this transmitter. So he just soldered the wires onto the tube and then taped the tube to the chassis. I couldn't believe it. Darn thing worked. I said, geez, how did it work? Well, he says, all you have to do is connect it, It's probably a better connection than a tube socket anyway. He was good. He was good. A lot of great people were his victims, and I imagine he was responsible for well over 1,000 hams. When I wrote that article, September CQ, what am I saying? September CQ, I wrote that article. I got a lot of fan mail about it, and I got email from people who were his students before and after me, and people who one guy came up to me and said I helped him study for his test, his novice test. I didn't remember that, but it was really pretty neat. It was really pretty neat to see the impact that an educator, a man of his stature, could do for the kids. And it wasn't just passing the license. It was shepherding them along, making sure they were able to make contacts and that kind of stuff. It was really pretty cool. What a great guy. What a great guy. I miss him terribly.
I read in an article in CQ Magazine that you also authored in 2003 that you had a ham radio moment. Can you tell us what that moment was and how it came about?
That was the 9-minute QSO.
That's right.
The 9-minute QSO. That was I was Boy Scout leader for, or one of the leaders for my son's troops. I had 3 sons and 1 daughter. We all were involved in everything. Dad went with everything, got to go on the camping trips. All the fathers would go on the camping trip. So anyway, we were going to the National Jamboree, and my kids, the scouts, designed a patch. They designed and Boy Scouts have all these patches, and this was a patch. Typically, patches commemorate the adventure that you're going on or some sort of activity, and so they designed this patch. We went on the camporee and I had all these patches, and it was really pretty cool. And after it was over, I came back to work here at Cooper, and I was talking to one of my colleagues who was a professor in the art school. And she was saying, I was telling her, oh, we did some artsy stuff. I got the scouts to do some artsy stuff. Of course, they have a different definition of artsy. But I said, well, we made some patches. And she says, oh, I have some patches. I have some NASA patches, she says to me. I go, NASA patches? I'm the guy who was, you and I probably both lived through the Man on the Moon. And I said, NASA patches? Oh, yeah. She says, oh, my brother-in-law is an astronaut. And I still, your brother-in-law is an astronaut. Well, I went kind of, oh, man. So to make a long story short, or vice versa, she told her brother-in-law that there was this nut that works with her that's this ham radio guy, and he does scouting, and he has these patches. So the Don Thomas, who was the astronaut, said, well, why don't you ask him if to give me one of his scout patches, and I'll take it up on my next mission. And he flew the patch on STS-70, which is he took our Boy Scout patch up there, and when he came back to Earth, he came back and not only gave the patch back with a certificate saying that it went around the world a zillion times, but he gave a bunch of patches from his mission that flew with him to give to all the scouts in the troop. And it was really great. And the day that he gave it back to us was the day that he said he was coming into New York, so he was going to come into Cooper Union to see his sister-in-law and ride the Cyclone. That's one of the things that he does, the opening day for the Cyclone, which is a roller coaster in Coney Island. He was going to come in and he was going to deliver the patch in person. So I told my class of students, you want to know what kind of a professor you got? I have an astronaut coming. He'll be in my office. So why don't you guys all come up and see if you can see the astronaut? And wouldn't you know, the astronaut was prepared. And not only did he return the patch to us, but he had a videotape that we played describing his mission, and he talked to all of my students. I had over 100 kids in my laboratory, and he did the whole thing. And then they wanted to take pictures of him. And he says, just a second. He goes into my office and he changes into his flight suit, one of those blue jumpsuits. And he comes back out and he says, geez, they take all the pictures. And he turns to me and he says, I see you had a telegraph key on your desk. I have a Vibroplex bug sitting on my desk. And I says, yes. He says, I'm a ham radio operator. He says, so am I. KC5 FVF, Foxtrot, Victor, Foxtrot. I do it from the shuttle. I go, oh, you got to be kidding me. Man, I'd give anything to work you in the shuttle. He says, well, you never know. You never know. And sure enough, a year later, we get the opportunity to run a Cerex contact. And there's a special kind when a member of the astronaut crew requests that a ham does it, a lot of paperwork is eliminated because that just has to happen then, because the astronauts want to do it. And we had a great time, and I could go on. I give a talk about this. I could go on for much longer than this podcast. We could do another one maybe, but talking about all the adventure. But in any case, he flew on STS 83 and STS-94. There's the only two flights of NASA that were exactly the same with the same crew, because we were supposed to have a public school in New York City, third graders, interview Don Thomas on the air from Cooper Union. They had all these questions. And the first time he went up, there was a problem with their fuel cells. They had to abort the mission after 3 or 4 days in orbit and come back down. And what turned out to be, he came back and answered all the questions for the kids in an assembly, and then he said, "We're going to send the mission up again. You want to go and watch it take off?" And then I became the guest of NASA and an astronaut to watch STS-94 fly. It was the coolest thing I'd ever done. And at that point in time, we were able to have a good contact. The questions were answered. We had a lot of publicity. And I have milked that ham radio experience for all that it's worth, including interviewing other astronauts. I even got to, if you've, in one of the issues of CQ, there was an interview with then the brand new administrator of NASA, Mike Griffin. And he's a ham, and we got to interview him. Rich Moseson and I did that. And a lot of that was just because I met this astronaut who was a very, very good man and an authority in NASA who was a lot of fun. He's still out there. KC5FBF is still out there.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO.
So I have another question for you, because I'm listening to all this, and and obviously you care a lot about ham radio and about education. Given the effectiveness of the internet to connecting all of us together worldwide, how would you use this amazing resource to mentor new ham licensees beyond the initial dual band walkie-talkie to the more mainstream ham radio activity?
Well, that's a good question. I often get, well, we've got the internet now, why do we need, and cell phones, why do we need ham radio? I get those comments from the non-believers. And then, unplug everything and see if it works, The problems that I have seen over the years with everybody, it's very easy to get a ham license now, and I applaud that. It had to be easy for me to get it too, because I just memorized stuff. I didn't really know the things that I was required to send back and answer multiple choice. I applaud that, but the two-way walkie-talkies, the two-band walkie-talkies, or the 2-meter repeaters and all that kind of stuff, gets some people hooked, but there's far more to it than just that. And in my area, it seems like repeaters are less popular than they used to be, so there's not as much activity on it, and a lot of the hams are having second thoughts about using the ham radio in the car while driving because of the distracted driving thing, even though it's quote, legal in New Jersey to do that where I live, but you are distracted when you do it. So I always thought that, the advantage should be that you get these people the license, and then the classes should continue on for a period of time where they actually make so many contacts in various modes. And that's where I'm afraid we're dropping the ball, is that we're not following through on the great things. Because I have met other people who, I have a ham license, but I never really got on the air much. I went to the class, I took the stuff, I passed the course, and I didn't get on the air. I got a radio, but I couldn't get it to work. And the clubs, I guess, are the only way you can do it, unless you're lucky enough to find a ham that's willing to do it. When I was a kid in California, I would walk around the neighborhood. There were towers everywhere. There were tri-banders on. Had to be 6 or 7 hams in my neighborhood, and I just knock on the door. That doesn't happen anymore. People don't do that anymore. Different times, but I think we have to shepherd them through a certain stage so that they can be independent and do that. I have quite a few students who get their ham license and just never really embrace it because they've all got stuff to do. And even with my own son, he's got stuff to do. He doesn't have time to get on the air much. He listens sometimes with a VHF mobile rig that he's got in his house. But he does go to Dayton with me every year. So there's that. I think what we're missing though is the camaraderie and the culture that is beyond just the VHF stuff. There's nothing like listening to the static on 40 or 80 meters and tuning around on a late night and hear a faint signal, and it finds out that it's Europe or something. The other night I worked Slovak Republic, on 40 with 5 watts, and because I turned the KX3 down to 5 watts, and I said, "Well, listen to that," and I said, "I wonder if I can work them," and I worked them, and it was. Of course, everything's 599 nowadays. So I'm sure I was 599 there, but it didn't matter. I made the contact, and that connection, I consider it a miracle every time I do anything like that, and so that's a lot easier. But the internet has been useful in ham radio for connecting people far away. Things like I was involved a little bit in the IRLP stuff for our repeater club, and we were able to do an awful lot of good stuff. It's really not about the spectrum or the radio, it's about connecting the hams together and having a dialogue. I believe it's as much of a social hobby as it is a technical hobby.
So we can use the internet then maybe as the virtual amateur radio club as a way to maybe connect people. I mean, we see this, for example, with the clubs like the Straight Key Century Club. You join it over the internet. It's a way for you to connect with a national organization, for example.
Oh, it's fantastic. You get to talk to people all over the world that way, and then, but it's got to push you into trying to do it other ways as well. But there's so many resources. I mean, you can now go on and online. You can take practice tests. That's great. That's a great thing, and that's a great way to learn to get through it. And then when are you going to get a chance to have a conversation with anybody, randomly? Certainly, whenever I have an article out, somebody's going to comment, and it's far away, or it's kind of neat. Not everybody's going to jump on your especially if you don't get on the air much, jump into your contact and say, "Bob, I read your article." That hasn't happened yet, but I do get emails, and so yeah. If you look real closely at the origins of the internet, you're going to find in a lot of the code people's call letters, and a lot of the original stuff looks a lot. Data is data, and CW is actually binary transmissions. Hit the key on, off, just the length of time that you hold the key down. So a lot of the people who started doing this kind of computing technology were people who were attracted to it because they were doing ham radio in the beginning anyway. Whether they kept with the ham radio is any guess.
Yeah, they say CW is the first digital mode in ham radio. And that ham radio was the first social network.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, right? Before Facebook.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, it works. I remember seeing on the train some guy who had an HT, and I happen to have the exact same one on. I commute every day, and the mind wanders. Anyway, I saw this guy. He was a couple of seats up, and he was using it to access a repeater. And the nerd alert button goes on if I do ham radio, like in a train or something like that. And so he packs up stuff and he's leaving. And I walk up behind him and I take mine out and say, "Hey, did you leave this on the seat?" And he panics, right? I said, No, I'm just kidding. And so, but I was goofing on him. And by the way, a lot of that kind of stuff goes on in ham radio. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be a lot of fun. It's supposed to be engaging, and we do have a lot of fun. And this guy became a friend. He was the one that got me into this radio club that I'm in now. So it was a nice way to meet people, you know. It was a safe bet that he wasn't going to, blow you off after you saw that he's a ham too, you know. You never know though. But
if you were looking back on your younger ham radio self, is there anything that you would have done differently, or something in the hobby that you would pursue that you're not pursuing now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I still have the opportunity. By the way, it's a hobby where you always learn new things and try new things. The best thing that happened to me was the fact that I could never afford a better rig than the DX40 and the HR10, so I stayed on crystal-controlled CW for some time. I did have a VFO for the DX40. I take that back. Turns out that VFO had a little problem. It chirped, and so it kind of gave you a distinctive CW. People knew, UDC's on over there, unmodulated direct current. It chirped. That means the frequency kind of shifted when you hit the key. I fixed that, but it really wasn't the best CW rig in the world. But it was pretty good for AM phone, although at that point in time, everybody was switching from AM to single sideband, and now they're going back to AM, and there's a whole group of people with high fidelity AM and broader band sideband, all that.
Yeah, using broadcast transmitters from AM stations.
Oh yeah, I know. My mentor Don Loshy, W2DL, was he did a lot of maintenance of broadcast equipment, and so a lot of the hams in the neighborhoods that got the 5,000 watt AM band broadcast band transmitter, Don would help them get them working. Of course, you can't run 5,000 watts on the air, and so they didn't. And of course that's good because you saved those expensive tubes from burning up or getting tired by running it at a lower power. But there's a lot of guys who do that, and then they have whole studios. They set it up.
Yeah, they're beautiful. Those transmitters, when they're refurbished, are absolutely gorgeous.
Oh yeah, they're really neat. They got a lot of lights and dials, and they got different stages, and they're in these big racks. It's just awesome. And then when you look at the smaller stuff, you can almost, it's like a shack in your hand. You can work all this. The KX3 is an unbelievably cool radio for me. I don't want to give Elecraft too many commercials, but they make good stuff. And I grew up on Heathkit. I built tons of them. I even have a Heathkit tour right here in my office, a Benton Harbor lunchbox. And the support that Heathkit gave out was harder. There's another thing that the internet helps with. Now you have a problem with something, you can email the manufacturer, and the manufacturer gets back to you in 24 hours. It's not like a week and a half for them to answer your letter that you write them. Pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of things. The old radios, the broadcast stuff, are really kind of nice. I respect everyone who does whatever they do because there's so much to do in ham radio. I never did much space stuff until I was lucky enough to talk to the Space Shuttle Columbia when it in STS-94, and then I became a real space cadet. And I've talked to the space station. They have a good ham station up there. I've heard it all the time. We can actually see it go over my house. That's pretty cool to do. It's all these things. I don't think I would do anything different, but I'm so grateful that what I did, I've done, and I get to do more stuff.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, to new hams, my advice is to get active and make at least 100 contacts. Set up a goal to make 100 contacts, and keep in touch, and with your mentor or your elmer. For the new kids, I tell them the story about how beneficial the whole experience was for me. I would not be doing what I do today, and I'm very successful at it, had it not been for the empowerment that learning the stuff that I learned as a young kid and the confidence that I had in myself. And even talking to other people, that paid off great. And I said, this is a good thing to know about. And then I said, and by the way, it can be a lot of fun. And there are all sorts of great things. When I first got my license, one of the first things that my parents were taking out Mr. Miller and his wife to dinner at a restaurant in California. And it was that time that the Alaskan earthquake happened, which was one of the ham's greatest hours, because ham radio was the main line of communication between Alaska and the lower 48. And we're at at dinner, and we're finished, and Mr. Miller says, "Why don't you come on out to the car for a second?" We go out, and he had one of his transceivers in the car, and this is a big radio, and he tuned into the net. And he said, "Listen to this. They're the only communication." He gave me this whole talk about that. And it was really neat. Other great things, the World Trade Center issue. 9/11 was probably one of the greatest hours for ham radio. I listened to that. I didn't personally participate in it, although I wasn't very far from the chaos, maybe a mile or two, and I was here in New York at that day. But there's so much that can be done with ham radio, even if it's just using it as a tool to get kids to get inspired in science. You can do a lot of computer stuff. You can do a lot of different science experiments. This is the one that talks back to you. And there is what makes ham radio probably the most dynamic STEM application you can see. Because if you can do it, and it's not hard, all of a sudden people are talking back to you about it. And it's the sharing of information that is the key.
Bob, I want to thank you for coming on to QSO Today. You're amazingly enthusiastic about the hobby, and it's refreshing to hear it. I really appreciate your coming on board, and I want to wish you 73, and I hope to work you on 20.
Oh, I'll look for you. No, probably have to be CW. How good are you at that?
Not good, but I'm
slow.
I'm going to work. That's my goal this year, is to get my code speed up.
Okay, great. I can help you with that.
Sounds terrific. 73.
73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bob. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WB2UDC in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.